time had finally come. Mornings were cold and the days were getting shorter. Winter was on its way. All summer long, Robert, Ronald, and Leroy Rabbit had run and played. Their days were spent having fun, while at night they slept under the stars. But now, with cold weather near, the three rabbits began to think about how they would live during the long cold winter. Camping out wouldn't be so much fun once the snow started to fall. "I have an idea," said Robert. "We could move south for the winter. It's always warm there, and we could continue to live and play outside." "That's a good thought," said Ronald. "But that's a very long hop, and winter might come before we get there." Leroy agreed that all the hopping made the whole idea very uninteresting. "I guess we'll have to stay home this winter," said Robert. "But we don't have any home," cried Leroy. Suddenly Ronald hopped up. "We could stay with Uncle Jack Rabbit, over across the meadow," he shouted. "That's right!" exclaimed Robert, and away all three hopped to see Uncle Jack. When they arrived at Uncle Jack's house, quite a surprise greeted them. It seemed that Uncle Jack had moved out in a hurry, and his house was now occupied by one of the meanest red foxes that any of them had ever seen. Uncle Jack had moved so quickly that he didn't even take his name off of his mailbox. Robert, Ronald, and Leroy didn't even stop to ask where Uncle Jack had gone. Instead, they just tiptoed away, carefully without disturbing Mr. Fox. "Well," said Ronald, "it looks like a long cold winter for us." The three bunnies sat down again and thought of all the shivering ahead of them. Robert suddenly jumped up shouting, "Remember Gary Groundhog, the fellow who's always digging his hole at the edge of the cornfield where we were playing last spring? With all that digging he did, there's probably enough room for a dozen little rabbits like us." Off all three again hopped, this time to the other end of the meadow to see Gary. When they arrived, they saw one of the most beautiful groundhog holes that you can imagine. It had 5 entrances, a big lookout mound, and a big underground room, packed with Farmer Green's best ears of corn, not to mention some fine carrots from Mrs. Green's garden. Gary had worked hard all summer, and he was still working when 3 rabbits found him. He had just begun painting his house with a nice smooth coat of mud. "Hi, Gary," said the 3. "What brings you 3 here?" replied Gary, as he continued painting. "We have a problem," announced Leroy, "and we hope you can help us." "Sure," answered Gary. All 3 bunnies liked the friendly tone of Gary's voice. They immediately spoke together, telling him that they had no place to stay for the winter, and would he let them stay with him. "Sure," replied Gary. "Grab a brush, and when we get this place done, we'll all settle in for the winter." "A brush?" thought Leroy. "He's only started to paint," thought Ronnie. "There are 9 more rooms left to paint," thought Robert. "This sure looks like a lot of work," thought all 3. "On second thought," said Robert, "we had better check with Uncle Jack. He may want us to stay with him this year." Leroy immediately began to correct Robert, remembering Mr. Fox and Uncle Jack's not being home, and of course Mr. Fox's mean face staring out of the window of Jack's house. Ronnie and Robert quickly silenced him before he could say much more. Gary repeated his welcome. Thinking of all the work involved, the 3 continued to pretend that Uncle Jack was in the best of health and probably wanted their company for the winter. They thanked their friend and hopped back to the place where they originally met and talked about their close call with all that work. With that, all 3 sat down and began to think of the many cold nights and days ahead. They sat and they sat, thinking about where they might spend the winter. Suddenly, Ronnie's nose felt cold. Then Robert's nose began to quiver. Leroy looked at the end of his nose. Something white and fluffy had landed on it. It was a big, shiny snowflake. Soon the air was filled with snowflakes. They danced all over, everywhere. After a while, the 3 little rabbits looked like 3 snowmen. There they sat, frozen solid with the icicles hanging from their noses. The winter wind blew and blew. Winter went on and on. Then, all at once, a strange thing happened. A big furry rabbit with long pointed ears, wearing a warm woolen hat, came walking through the snow. He was the biggest bunny that Robert, Ronnie, or Leroy had ever seen. As he came closer, the 3 little rabbits began to shake more from fright than the cold winter wind. He picked up each of them and put them on his sled. Then, without a word, he pulled the sled to the far end of the snow-covered meadow. None of the 3 little rabbits had ever been this far into the woods. They finally reached a giant rabbit hole. Down into the hole all 3 slid. When they got inside, they saw the most wondrous thing. There were thousands and thousands of colored eggs, all colors, red, blue, yellow, and green, some with stripes and others with polka dots. This is where you'll spend the winter, said the big bunny. We have plenty of work to do between now and spring. Work didn't sound all that bad now. Robert, Ronnie, and Leroy knew it had to be better than being covered with snow and ice. They eagerly joined the other little bunnies in the hole, painting and decorating the eggs. Working can be fun, exclaimed Robert. This isn't so bad after all, says Ronnie. I like it here, said Leroy. Soon spring arrived. It came quickly. The big day was here. Robert, Ronnie, and Leroy, together with all the other little bunnies, left the rabbit hole loaded with baskets filled with eggs to deliver to boys and girls everywhere. It was Easter Sunday, and the three little rabbits were working for the Easter Bunny. Next Easter, if you look very carefully, maybe you'll see them. They're the proudest of all the Easter Bunny helpers. Wouldn't you be proud too?